welcome to Sensory Explained Simply. This is the second video in the series of 3, and my name is Trish Roberts, and I'm an occupational therapist, and my specialization is sensory processing issues in young children, either children who have sensory processing difficulties or sensory difficulties related to autism spectrum disorder or any aspect of sensory and how they function. So today's video follows the first video. Now the first video, if you haven't seen it, that is a precursor to this one. So I recommend you go back and watch that one first. That deals with the sensory systems and how they work individually and together, and that will help you better understand this video. All right, so this next video is talking about 3 aspects of sensory processing. Now that you understand how the sensory systems work, what we're looking at is how they help the brain interpret the information that they're sending to it. And so what we're looking at is primarily 3 aspects. The first one is called registration. The second one is called regulation, and the third one is called modulation. Those are all fun words. All right, so the first one, when you're looking at registration, that truly is just as it sounds. It's how the child is registering or logging information in their brain. You need to remember that it starts when they're immediately hatched, right when they're born, and they start to log in that little empty brain of theirs every aspect. They're just registering basic physical aspects about their environment, and it's from all the sensory channels. Oh, my mom sounds like this, and a table looks like this. This is my blanket, it's soft, it smells like this, and they're picking up aspects of skill along the way. They're just basically registering the information. What they do from there is they start to regulate their behavior. So what happens is when they're getting a good amount into the nervous system of this basic registration of input, and that is registering everything in their environment, things that are new, but also things that are familiar. You need to be registering, oh, I hear that train, and that's my mom in the background. Oh, she just turned on the sink. Oh, here's my blanket. Oh, this is my, cup. This is all of those aspects. And they're processing it, and what happens is just through this process, it helps regulate their behavior and attending and their functioning. And so when you think of regulation, you want to think of them in this mid-range. When they're regulating well, they are getting as much information in their environment as they possibly can. They're picking up everything that they're seeing, hearing, touching, feeling, and it's being integrated well. So for kiddos who have difficulty registering information, or regulating, I should say, they're registering basic information, and some of them don't register it well. So when I talk about these basic things, like what they're seeing, what they're hearing, instead of perceiving it like most children do, some children have a hard time registering that information correctly. So that's where clothing textures, food textures, temperature, auditory, they don't register it well, and so it's a misperception of that input. So that's one thing you want to be mindful of, is a disproportionate or an unusual response to basic sensory input can be a sign of a sensory processing disorder. Now when we get into how they regulate, is just through this process, like I talked about, of registering input, it actually helps regulate the nervous system. Because if you're in this mid-range, the nervous system is being fed a nice, steady, consistent flow of input, and it's actually nourishing the nervous system. You want to think of everything that the child is doing is providing this great stimulation to the child so it can maximize their learning. So kiddos who have a hard time with registering input, it's that the nervous system, if it's not perceiving the input well, is not functioning in this mid-range. And those are kiddos who either are too highly registered, and that's when they are overwhelmed or melting down, or they have what we call low registration. Those are kiddos that are somewhat sleepy, for lack of a better word. Lots of stuff is kind of blowing by them. They're kind of off in their own little world. They may not attend very well, not the best eye contact, those type things. So what happens is, if you're not in this mid-range, obviously opportunity is lost. If you're overwhelmed, think about if you have a migraine, let's say, how much learning is going to happen when you have a migraine? How many social interactions are you experiencing? No, you just can't tolerate it. You need to kind of eliminate as much as you can. Same thing with the child who's under-registrated, or that low registration kiddo. You want to think of this kind of as when you are bone tired, just about ready to fall asleep at night. How much learning are you doing at that time? How many social interactions? Not the best time to learn calculus, that kind of thing. So what you can see is we either want to be bringing those kiddos who don't regulate well down if they're overregulated, or if they're underregulated, you want to bring them up. And you can do that through some of the sensory activities we'll talk about in the next video. But the optimal place for learning, where the nervous system is optimally stimulated, is in this mid-range. And that's when you're really going to see the child functioning well. And when they're either over or under, one thing you need to remember too is not all children, most children do have a variable response. At times they're understimulated, at times they're overstimulated. And so that's where the activities we talk about in the next video are going to be very helpful in you understanding, okay, I know my child is overstimulated, what do I do in that situation? Or I know it's so hard to get my child's attention, they're so understimulated, what can I do to kind of maximize activities that we're working on? And then the final aspect that I want to talk about in this video is called modulation. And what modulation is how the child regulates the volume or the flow of input. So in other words, with modulation, you have to think of anything they're doing, there is a variety of sensory stimulation that is bombarding their senses. And in some situations, there's not as much. In other situations, there's a huge amount of stimulation. And so that's where they have a hard time with modulating that. So we know with some kiddos, if you give them a little bit, they can handle it. But as you add more and more and more, they aren't able to continue to kind of modulate and build upon that. So that is another aspect that we work on with sensory kiddos. Because for most kids, what they're doing is they're registering input, it's regulating their nervous system, they're functioning well, they're happy, and they're able to modulate well. As the volume of sensory input increases, the volume of things in their environment that they're expected to process increases, they're able to acclimate to that. But for sensory cuties, when they have difficulty with that, it needs to be a much more systematic approach to help them with that modulation. And the last thing I just want to kind of talk about is an example of this, because the one thing I really want you to understand is that sensory processing is in every aspect of the child's functioning. There is nothing that they don't do that the sensory systems aren't involved. And so what you want to be thinking about is, one, understanding in every aspect the sensory pieces at play, and understanding what you can do to help them. But one example that I like to give is, you want to think about, let's use a metaphor here of an Easter egg hunt. And so if you think of a little one and they've got their Easter basket and all around are the Easter eggs, and we're going to have the Easter eggs represent skill in their environment. So there are social skills, there are language skills, there are learning skills, there are motor opportunities, all of these things all around. Now, if the child is functioning in this mid-range, like most kiddos, when they go on this Easter egg hunt, they are getting every egg that they can, and you can see how much skill they're building into their kind of bag of tricks. But if a child has a sensory processing difficulty, it creates a difficulty in acquiring those skills. And so what we want to do is maximize that. So when you're thinking about a little one who has a sensory processing difficulty, if they're way over registered, that's the little kiddo that's going to have a meltdown and not get any eggs. Or if they have a motor difficulty, that's going to be the kiddo who maybe isn't able to climb up into the tree to get that egg, or drops the egg out of their basket and doesn't even realize it. They're just kind of missing it. Or if you have a kiddo that doesn't register information properly, they're too fearful to reach into the grass because they can't tolerate the texture of the grass. So what we always want to be doing is maximizing and helping those sensory systems function better, so that maximizes opportunities for the child to learn and develop skill.